or we're going to determine the navigation in one of our menus based on the results of this. So really articulating that early on is going to save you some time and help you focus on your efforts. This is a principle that we talked about last time, so I just wanted to remind everybody that as you think about when to do a usability test, the earlier you start testing, the better most of the time. From Steve Krug's book, Don't Make Me Think, one of the quotes from that book is start earlier than you think makes sense. So that means that you don't have to wait till you have something fully fleshed out before you can start getting some input from your users. And that will actually be a really good investment early on to make better decisions at the beginning and save a lot of time. And this is another principle that relates to that. So remembering that it's okay to test something that's incomplete and even static. So you can even test paper. Paper prototyping has become more common, and you do often hear about examples where people are taking a piece of paper that looks like a website and getting input on it before they've even made it up on a web page. It's just a document at that point, or a Photoshop document, something like that. This is just an example from my library where we took a bunch of students and faculty and brought them into a room and gave them components of a website and had them place it in different places on the paper to kind of build their ideal homepage. So this was all just screenshots from different websites. It was nothing that was really interactive, but we wanted to kind of get that input early on to see what people thought. So you can get a little creative with that. So another thing as you're doing your planning for a usability test is think about what brings users to your website. You might recognize Cheyenne from last time. She is our persona who represents our undergraduate first-year audience. And so thinking about what do they want to know, what are those goals that they have, knowledge that they really need to obtain, like what are the hours or what are the checkout periods, that type of thing. And then what do they want to do? So is there a transactional thing like renewing a book or requesting a piece of technology? So thinking about those primary tasks, and we talked a little bit last time about how you go about getting that sort of information through analytics and other data, and defining those things to help focus on what are the users' most important goals that they have in order to then frame your usability test. So in order to identify those primary tasks, you can look at Google Analytics if you have an analytics tool of some sort. Focus group data is another great place to go if you have some of that going on in your library already, or you can conduct some. Question logs, so maybe if you have people at the desk who actually log the types of questions that they're getting throughout the day, that can really help you figure out what those most important things are. And if people are calling on the phone or coming to the desk with these questions, it might be because it's not so easy to find that information on your website. So those could be really good candidates for usability testing. If you do something formal like LibQual, a LibQual survey, or maybe you do other types of customer feedback surveys, that data can be really valuable and can also drive deciding and narrowing down what those primary tasks are for your website. Another thing to think about as you're determining what to test is to try and avoid testing things that you can't change. So things that might be sort of set in stone. Maybe that's things related to your catalog system and your discovery layer or databases. Other things that are really important to users that you have a little bit less control over. You can't customize everything. You might find out information that it turns out to be a larger issue that maybe is important to know about, like you have a metadata issue that's causing the search results to come up in a not an intuitive way. That can be useful to know, but it can be frustrating if you can't do anything about it. So especially as you're getting started, try to test things that you have control over and that you can change. Things like the hours on your website, just narrowing those down to think about that up front so you don't get disappointed as you find results and usability issues you can't then address. So some examples of tasks that you might come up with. Finding a specific book or ebook title. So this might relate to your catalog and this might relate to your discovery layer, but it's also a core task, and maybe that is something you want to test because you have some control over how the search box looks on the home page or what facets are defined on the home page or drop-down menus, that kind of thing. Finding a specific book or ebook title is finding a known item. There's also a related task like finding a book based on a topic, and those are distinct and they're different, and the results that you get will be different based on how you frame that type of search task. Finding open hours is another one, very common. People often expect this on the home page, so see if they can find it, see if they can find that information. Checking out a laptop is a really big one for us, is to find, is there a laptop available right now? We have that information on our website and want to make sure people can find that. That's one of our most heavily used services. And actually just this week, I found out that we now check out more technology than we do books in our library, which I thought was kind of incredible, and I hadn't heard that statistic before, and I was surprised by that, but we check out so much equipment every day. It now outweighs how much we check out as far as books. Reserving a study room is another huge one for us, and for many academic libraries at least, so that's another one essentially to test. Requesting an interlibrary loan, another huge service, something that we spend a lot of money and invest a lot of resources into, and that's a very valued service for our campus. That's another one that we've done extensive testing on. Suggesting items for purchase is something that we've done testing on, and that came up in a number of focus groups, especially with faculty and grad students, that was an important task for them, was how do I request something that you don't have? And maybe it's not an interlibrary loan, maybe I want to have it in the library so my students can access it, or other scholars on campus can access it. And then donating money and donating books. Those are things that we want people to do, so we really want to make sure that those things are easy to do on our website. So that's just a few examples of the types of things you'll be thinking about. So once you have your tasks figured out, you have to then translate them into scenarios. So a task is what you want the user to do, like find a book. The scenario is what you tell them to do. So in general, you're not going to just tell someone, find a book. You need to put them in some context and give them some specifics around that. And you also need to be careful not to lead them. So as you're writing a scenario, you need to be careful not to say the trigger word that is actually then going to direct them to something on your website that they might not have gone to if you hadn't phrased the scenario that way. So if you have a big link on your homepage that says reserve a study room, and then you give them the task, reserve a study room, that's a little too obvious, and that might not really test what you're trying to test to find out, can people find this on their own without that leading terminology. So here's a couple examples. In this case, the task is check out a laptop. And for that, instead of just saying check out a laptop, we're going to say your laptop crashed last night. So you give them that kind of context. And then find out if you can borrow a MacBook from the library and for how long. So you can see here we're testing a few different things. We're specifically asking them about a MacBook because we actually list all of our different technology on different pages on the site, and we want to make sure people can navigate those pages to find a specific type of technology. And then we want to make sure once they get to that page that they can see how long they can check the item out for. So make sure that that content is clear on the page once they get there. So that's a few different things testing within one broader task of checking out a laptop. Suggesting items for purchase, similar example. So in this case, we give them a specific book that we don't have, and so we put them in that, what's the situation where I might want to suggest an item for purchase. The library doesn't have the latest edition of the Associated Press style book, and in this case, this was a real-life example because we didn't have it, and a lot of professors wanted us to have it. So, but they weren't requesting it because they didn't know how, or it wasn't obvious on our website that they could do that. So we came up with a scenario based on that. So request that the library order this book. And another thing to notice here is in our navigation, we use the term suggest. So in the scenario, we use the term order, just to keep that different enough so they're not looking for the term suggest and being led that way. So then you need to identify what you'll test. So we talked earlier, maybe you have a paper prototype at this point. This is an example I found from Stanford University where they had a prototype of their tab search box for their homepage. I thought that was kind of a cool example for a library where they got creative and even not just having a single sheet of paper, but they had 3 sheets of paper that actually looked like tabs that you could then interact with and go to the different ones and get feedback on. That was pretty interesting. You can also do something like an interactive PowerPoint. PowerPoint lets you link between slides, and you can make buttons, things that look like buttons, and have them navigate across different slides to find information. That's an easy thing to do if you're trying to test out a concept in the early stages. Another thing you can do is if you have a staging or a test environment for your website, make some significant changes there and get feedback before moving them into a production website. That can be a good thing if you're trying to do some significant changes to your site, or you have a brand new site but it's not ready to go live. Make it available on your laptop or your computer that you can then bring the participant to in order to do the test. And then your production website, if you have something live and you want to test your actual website that you have now, that's a good way, obvious way to do that, is just live on your website. And then you'll need to identify a facilitator and a note taker. And I always recommend having 2 people involved because it can be really hard to both facilitate a test and take notes that are useful. It lessens the burden on one person. It also allows you to have a couple people there so that when you debrief, you can kind of check your assumptions and any biases that might have come in and make sure that you're getting a more objective perspective on what happened and what behavior was observed. So as you're thinking about who would be a good facilitator, being approachable and a good listener is important for this because you need to make the participants feel comfortable and that they're not, one of the things that we said, I think, in the last one is you don't want them to think that they can do something wrong as a participant. You want them to know that you're testing the website, you're not testing them. And so kind of that sort of approachable, good listener, and also someone that's comfortable with the goals of the test and really understands the concept. They can kind of help ask the right probing questions as they come up and as they're needed. That's going to really make for a good facilitator. A note taker, I've always found that taking notes live during the actual session is much easier than either just recording it, using a video record system, or then looking at it later and then trying to take notes, because there are things that are captured in the real life experience that just seem to work better. You notice them more during the actual test, and taking notes in person, it found to be useful. Although we do usually take notes on a laptop, and it saves a lot of time. Instead of we used to write them up and then transcribe, but we tend to bring another laptop now with us to do the note taking. So someone who's fast, we just did a test yesterday, and I have a brand new grad assistant, Christina, and she was watching me take notes, and she's like, "Oh my God, I can't type that fast." I'm like, it just comes with practice after you've done a lot of these. I try to take vicious notes and capture. I capture a lot of quotes as people are saying things. And I think so having someone that can be a fast note taker is important. Things happen really quickly during a lot of these tests, and trying to keep up with the pace can be a challenge for some people. So if you have someone that has that skill set already, I encourage you to recruit them as your note taker, or just build that as you keep doing it, you'll get better at it. Yeah, fast, detail-oriented, that can pay attention to those little details, like where the person is clicking on the page, where they're scrolling down, that kind of thing. And also, this person should also be familiar with the website and familiar with the goals of the test, which will just help them take better notes and capture what's really important, because they won't be able to capture everything. This is an example on the right from my real life. So Cameron is there with a laptop. He's taking notes. He's my undergraduate student worker. And then Anthony on the right is our research and learning librarian who participated in this particular study. And so he was one of the facilitators, which was great because he already has good rapport with faculty and was able to really engage them in the test. So that was pretty cool. So thinking about who is your audience, and this is an important thing to consider as you're doing your planning, and thinking about what characteristics do participants really need to have in order to provide you with good data. So in this example, this is Betsy. She's a researcher here at the university, and we were doing a test specifically on support services for researchers, so faculty that are working on big grants that have needs like data management and writing grant proposals and getting copyright advice and journal publishing and all those types of things. So for that particular test, we really needed to have people that were involved in that type of work. So we couldn't recruit undergraduates. So in this case, we did targeted recruitment with specific faculty that we knew were engaged in this type of thing and that would find value in those services and understand what those services were for. So there's Betsy. And so there's 2 different types of recruitment. I mean, there's many different types, but these are kind of the 2 core ones that I've used successfully. So targeted recruitment is where you do formal recruitment in advance. So in Betsy's case, we had emailed her a few weeks before and said, we're doing this study. We really want to hear from researchers, help improve the experience for faculty on campus. And so we set up appointments in advance and had them come in for our sessions and sit with us and get their feedback. That works well for certain things. What we do most of the time, though, is intercept recruitment, and this is much looser recruitment, and it's on the fly, on the day, in person. So in this case, we go to the library lobby generally, we set up a table, and we recruit people on the fly. Something you might remember from the last session, this is one of the principles, is that almost all recruits are going to provide you with useful data. So recruit loosely and grade on a curve. This is another quote from Steve Krug, almost being obviously not the baby. And in the case of the researchers that I was talking about in the last slide, undergraduates would not have been that useful for that specific thing. But for most of the things on our library website, searching, using the discovery tool, booking rooms, checking hours, checking out technology, that's all useful stuff for everybody. And most of the people that walk in our front doors are undergraduate students. So we do have some graduate students and faculty, and all of them would provide useful information. So Intercept Recruitment, this is another real-life example. You might recognize Cameron there in the back. This is him doing a usability test with a student on LibCal, which is something we implemented over the summer. And so this is our standard location that we go. We have a table with folding that we just pull out and a basket of treats, and we sit there and we recruit people on the fly and just ask them to come sit with us for a few minutes, get a snack, and give us some feedback. Targeted recruitment, as I mentioned before, is where you're going to invite participants and schedule those sessions in advance. I gave you the example of some of those research support services that are really geared towards faculty and some graduate students. We've also done targeted recruitment for things like our special collections website, which was also something that most undergraduates would not use, especially the types of things that we were trying to test with collections and using manuscripts and finding aids. The history faculty gave us immensely helpful feedback. We did do some testing with students, and it was less helpful because they weren't really the audience for those services. So think about that. You also decide on what you'll capture. So you do have the option, obviously, of handwritten or typed notes, logistical things to think about in advance. Are you going to do a screen recording? So there are lots of tools you can use that are free online. We often just use QuickTime on the Mac, and that works well. You can pay for more expensive screen recording software like Mori, which is geared specifically for usability testing, and it captures everything, including the webcam of the person and their expressions, all of their mouse clicks, and you can even track the tasks. And if you're doing a longer test, that can be really useful for going back and reviewing. But think about what software is really useful for you in your context. Do you want to capture a number of attempts? So that's something we almost always capture is we have a task, and then at the end of it we say how many tries did it take for them to be successful. And we judge that based on if they hit the back button, that's a new attempt. So that means they tried one pass, and then they had to go back, and then they tried again, and then they had to go back, and then they tried again, and then they went to the home page, and then they went to Google. Any time that they leave the website or they hit the back button, we say it's a new attempt. Another thing we started tracking more recently is time on task. So actually having a little stopwatch and tracking how long it takes someone to complete a task. That's been really helpful, especially for showing the impact of our work. So we do pre-testing and post-testing, and we'll measure the time on task and see, can we reduce the time on task for this particular thing? And that's a really good way to share the value of something that you're working on. And here's a screenshot of our standard template that we use for taking notes. So you can see here that it's a nice reusable template. So we almost always ask questions before the test, like the person's name, just their first name, just to capture, which has been helpful for us to, during our debrief, to have names in mind, their year, their major, if they've used the library website before. And just a couple things that we have to remember to say as we're introducing the test. And then underneath we have a table where we actually track the person's name as a participant, how they use the website, what's the navigation path. That's another core thing to capture in your notes. Number of attempts, time spent, were they ultimately successful or did they ultimately fail at completing the task? And then any quotes and comments in that last column. And this has been a really helpful thing for us to just reuse easily, and it's helped with training and just being more consistent in how we're capturing our notes. So incentives, it's always useful to give people something for their time. So in intercept mode, we tend to just have snacks and some drinks, maybe some bottled water. Other options and things that I've seen other libraries do is swag. So maybe you have some water bottles that are giveaways, or tote bags or T-shirts, other things like that that you might have on hand that your marketing department might have and can provide for you. Or maybe you have gift cards, especially if you're doing longer sessions where you're inviting people and doing targeted recruitment. It can be helpful to have something a little more meaningful, like a $20 gift card to Starbucks or something like that. For the faculty, we have a very hard time getting gift cards because of campus policy. So for faculty, we've had success just providing coffee and pastries, and that's worked well. So something else to think about. And you'll have to pick a time, so both time of day and day of the week. If we're doing lobby recruitment, we found that Wednesday afternoons and Sunday nights are our busiest time in the library, although we're pretty successful just in general from 12 to 5 Monday through Friday, so that works well. Fridays tend to be less busy, so we usually avoid doing Fridays, but thinking about that, if you're doing that level of recruitment, who's going to be around? And the summer is usually harder, but we were strangely successful over the summer as we were testing LibCal and our staff directory and some other things in the last few months. It took a little bit longer to find some people, but we were actually still successful, and it was still worth the time to do it in the summer as well. Another thing to think about is where you're going to do this. So are you going to do it in the library, or do you want to go out maybe on your campus or in your community? So we've had success in the student union. Not at lunchtime, that's harder because it's crazy in there, but in other hours, people actually just go there to hang out and to study, and they're walking around. A lot of times that's where they kill time, so they're willing to spend a few minutes with you for an activity like a usability test. I know other libraries that go to their coffee shop. We have a coffee shop next door, but that's also kind of crazy, so we don't do that as often. So it all depends on your situation and where would make sense for you. You might also consider booking a study room or a meeting room. So even if you're doing interset recruitment, maybe you don't want to stay in the lobby, it's too loud, it's too distracting. Maybe there's a meeting room or study room nearby that you can then walk the participants over to. And we've done that as well, especially certain times of year where it is really distracting to have a hustle bustle of a lobby and try to get people's feedback. So we've varied on that. And I'd be curious to hear from others how they found a good spot for their tests if you're doing that type of thing already. So another option is to go to them. I've done this a couple times. It's a really interesting approach, and I recommend it. I want to do more of it, where you don't just have them come to you or reach out to them kind of in public spaces, but you set up times to actually be in a space where they actually do their work and do their studying. So going to faculty offices where they're actually going to be using your website and library services from that space. So you might learn a little bit more if you go into their actual space. Dorm rooms for students, classrooms for both instructors and students, going into those spaces where they're out in the wild in their real life doing this type of thing. You can gather a lot more insight into their technology setup, their distractions, and how they manage all of that. So then you're going to need to sort of pick the technology. So thinking about what device and what browser you're going to use. If you're going to limit that, it can make a big difference if someone is on a Mac and they haven't used a Mac as regularly and aren't comfortable with it. Or if you force them into a browser that they don't usually use, that can make a difference. If you have a mouse or you don't have a mouse and you ask them to use the touchpad and they're not really someone who uses the touchpad, that's another consideration. And screen capturing, we already talked a little bit about. Or BYOD being bring your own device and just ask them to use their device that they have on them, whether they have a laptop or maybe they have a smartphone, and you can ask them to interact with your website that way. And that's always been really interesting, and especially as those devices are, there's so many different types now, and keeping track of it, and we do browser testing and we try to do testing on different devices, but having actual real people use their real devices can be insightful to discovering and uncovering usability issues. This is just a screenshot from one of our usability tests. We record all of them now, unless we are doing the bring your own device variation. When we bring a laptop down to the lobby, we record everything, and we have it stored for future use, which has been really helpful. So then some logistics. This is a photo of Monique and Rachel. They were some student workers a couple of years back now, and this was their setup. So it's also in the library lobby, but it was actually off in a different section, off to the west side of our first floor. And you can see they had a tablecloth, and they had a laptop, and then Monique had her, she's going to do handwritten notes at this point and try to stay up with things. And then we had candy, so we just went to Costco and got some candy and kind of laid it out on the table. And then we had a sign that said, give us 5 minutes, help us improve our website, and get a free candy bar. And that was pretty successful. And this was a pathway where a lot of students were walking back and forth, so it was pretty easy to get people to stop for a few minutes. And it was also loud enough that we weren't distracting. That's another thing to think about as far as what space to use. But yeah, logistics, so signage, table, chairs, technology, release forms. So if you are planning to use, if you're planning to record them in some way or trying to use the information at a later date, maybe you want to take some photos, just having those release forms on hand can be helpful. So we have a stack of those we bring with us and make sure that we have people sign that if we plan to use it publicly or in a presentation or something like that. So now time for questions from everyone. I'm curious to hear what else might you need as you're planning for a usability test, and if you've done this type of work, what challenges you have or anticipate having. So I'd like to hear what you think.
Yep, Rebecca, Tricia had chatted to us that one of her questions, and I guess is part of the planning. She said that sometimes it's just difficult finding students for these tests and getting them to show up. So that
so that's doing targeted recruitment with students. Is it undergrad, I wonder?
Let's see. She has well, maybe she will chat and let us know if it's undergrad. But while Tricia is answering whether there are undergraduate students, just thought I'd throw out the census for our group today since we had everyone sign in and say where they were from. So we have Ohio, California, Toronto, Texas, and Louisiana were the prime chatters there. So we have a cross time zone group here and all. And so you do chat your questions. Nanette and I are here, and we will pass them on to Rebecca, and especially for the ones on the screen. If you have any thoughts on that, because Tricia did the challenge.
Yeah, and I will say that we've done less of the targeted recruitment with students, and so the recruitment that we've done with faculty and grad students, we've had success in them showing up. I'm not sure why. I will say actually that we did, in a study we did over the summer where we recruited the researchers, including Betsy, who you saw earlier, we did have 1 of 8 of the faculty not show up, but that means 7 of 8 did show up, which was great. And I remember following up with the faculty member who was apologetic and had the wrong date and that kind of thing. We invited him back. I haven't had the issue because most of when we're recruiting undergraduates, we tend to just do in person. I might suggest if you're trying to schedule longer sessions, because you can't recruit someone in the lobby usually and say, oh, do you have an hour to spare and come sit with me? So if you're trying to do those longer sessions, you could still try some in-person recruitment maybe in the morning and say, we're planning this thing for the afternoon. Are you free any of these hours? And have them sign up that day. And they might be more likely, just knowing student schedules and how hard it is for them to kind of juggle everything, maybe doing something closer to the time that, like, can you come back in half an hour? That kind of thing might be an approach that would work a little bit better. It's hard, I do know, I mean, Steve Krug always says to have backups, although I'm not sure of the logistics of how that works if the backups show up and you have your other person there, how to do all the testing with both. It's tricky if other people have suggestions on that, and I'm not sure if there's incentives involved, if the incentives aren't enough to keep people responsible and showing up.
Yeah.
I'm curious. We've been lucky that we have so many students all the time that they're sort of easy. Another suggestion, I mean, we have a list of people that we've recruited in the past that have been really helpful, that are kind of our library advocates in a lot of ways, that really want to help us improve the library experience. And we have a list of them in a spreadsheet that we can then reach out to individuals to recruit them for particular things. And since we've worked with them before, they tend to be responsible, and they tend to be responsive to our requests as well. So that might be helpful.
Okay, great. Anna also asked about mobile devices. Do you use any mobile devices, or have you also used any in your testing?
Yeah, we've asked students, as we're doing the intercept recruitment, to use their own device. So if they have a device with them, to take it out and we can do testing. We've done that. We also had, a few years ago when it was almost the early stages of responsive design websites, we had a web designer who brought his phone down with me, and the two of us walked around and handed his phone to other people and had them test it. And that was really fascinating because it was also sort of the early days of smartphones, and not everyone was completely comfortable with them. And it was such a difference when you handed the phone to someone who had a smartphone and you handed it to someone who didn't, to see how they interacted with the site completely differently. That was kind of fascinating. It's been a little bit tricky because it's unlike a laptop where we can have like a shared laptop that we can bring around and give to other people. I can't just give my phone to my students and say, take this and work with this, because I need my phone with me all the time. And they might not be comfortable themselves giving their phone to someone else to test. So I tend to think that the mobile testing works best if it's bring your own device and asking the participant to use their own thing.
Right. And I have a question, and I believe Pamela may be from a public library because she was interested in the process used for developing the personas, and she points out that in a public setting, they would have to think about and develop multiple personas to represent their users. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, and you absolutely need multiple personas. So we have, in the first session, I talked a little bit more about this in depth, but we have primary personas and secondary personas. And our primary personas are our undergraduate students, our teaching assistant who's also a graduate student, our PhD student, a faculty member, and then for secondary personas, we have a library staff member, a potential donor, and a community member. And those were developed out of real research. I actually have some slides a little bit later about setting a foundation for your library where I'll talk more about how we did that development and how we get people engaged in the process. So maybe I'll get back to that once I get to those slides.
Okay, and I have two more. One I think is going to be sort of quick because it goes back to the bring your own device style testing. And the question from Virginia is, does that alter the number of users that you aim to test when you do that bring your own device style?
Sure. So I can't remember. I think it's in another slide coming up. And something I mentioned last time is that we usually aim for five users to test, and that tends to be enough to find out any major issues. So 5 isn't a lot, and it hasn't been a challenge to find 5 people who do have their own device. So I don't tend to change that based on what technology we're using or which device we're using. Although in some ways I could see the argument that because there's such a variety, it might be worth testing more of them because you'll uncover more as you have people using different types of devices than you would as you're doing a more controlled study where it's this one browser, this one operating system, this one screen size. So there could be an argument made for actually, testing with more people if you're doing that so that you can get a better breadth of devices and potential challenges around them.
Yes, certainly. And one last question from B, and this actually involves library staff. And so B is curious as to whether or not when you conducted your usability test and the results are revealed, if you encounter pushback from library staff who have certain opinions that kind of don't jive with what your results have shown.
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the things I found with usability testing that's really powerful is it can help sway those strong opinions. So there might be preconceived assumptions about things that we then, because of those potentially differing opinions in the room, that's a real justification for, well, let's go really ask the users and find out. So then the usability testing results can really help guide those decisions. And once you actually show people, I mean, this is actually another a reason why you might want to record these sessions is because if you show them to stakeholders, they're really powerful. For people to actually see someone struggling with an issue on your website, it's very hard for the stakeholder to then disagree with it once they've seen the proof and actually seen a person struggle or share that information. So I found that to be a really helpful tool in advocating for changes because you then have the data to back it up. And it can be recordings. I think I've done quotes. Quotes are powerful as well, but I think the actual recording and seeing the person and hearing their voice and seeing what they're doing on the site, it really makes the case.
Yeah, cool. Yep, and Tricia got back to us, Rebecca, and I know we're about to move on, but her population was undergraduate students, and she agrees that candy might be a very good idea.
And it's surprising, and even the ones this week, I think half of the students didn't even take the candy. They're just like, oh, I can spend 5 minutes helping the library. So they can, you know, I think a lot of it's the time thing. So if you can say it's less than 10 minutes, they often have that time. If you say it's an hour, that's harder for them based on their, you know, their schedule, and they're overwhelmed with classes and stuff. And candy, I mean, candy, cereal bars, and bottled water, you know. But, okay, I'll move on.
All right, great, guys. Thank you. Keep those chats coming.
So we're going to move into, now you've done all the planning, and maybe you have your table set up in the library lobby, you're ready to do the test, or you have people in a study room somewhere that you've recruited. And so now you're actually facilitating the test. So as you're doing that, as you introduce what's going on, letting the person know why we're doing this. So I'll often just say a general statement of we're doing this to improve the library, which I think helps motivate them as well to be thoughtful in their responses, because if it improves the library, it improves their lives as well. Letting them know that they really can't do anything wrong and being consistent with that. So as they go through the test and they're doing something that you're in your head thinking, they're not doing that the way I expected, or that doesn't seem right, don't say that out loud, being very neutral the whole time and being clear that there is no wrong answer here. You can't do anything wrong, literally. And then asking them to think out loud. And there are, I think I mentioned in the last session that you don't always have to have them think out loud. That's just one of the methodologies. It's the one I prefer, especially for most of the things that we test. But depending on what you're testing, you can alternatively do what's called a retrospective review, where at the end of the test, then you ask them to talk about their experience, rather than asking them to think out loud along the way. So there's different ways you can go with that depending on the context. For facilitating the test, you want to keep them talking, assuming you are doing the think aloud method. You want to keep your cool. So again, be neutral. Try not to react to things. It can be really hard to not gasp aloud if they're doing something unpredictable. But stay cool, stay neutral, and make sure that they're kind of staying cool too, because they might be getting frustrated if they're hitting a barrier, if they're on their 5th attempt to do something and they don't seem to be making any progress. Try to kind of play therapist and say, it's okay, this is really helpful, what might you try next? Let us know what you're thinking. We talk more about why you went to this place, that kind of thing. And being very friendly and approachable. That's kind of, as the facilitator mindset, trying not to be intimidating or coming across as talking down to them in any kind of way. And you don't want to lead the witness, so you want to keep your poker face. I just talked about this a little bit, but staying neutral and avoiding language like, oh, good, or that's right. Or worse than that would be like, oh, no, what are you doing? But don't confirm or validate that they are going on the right path, because that can alter the test results and incorporate bias into the test. So don't say anything other than this is helpful. Tell us more about that. Try to ask more questions as opposed to react to things. Especially it can be hard as they say, a lot of times the person is going to be tempted to say, am I on the right path? Am I doing this right? Is that right? It can be very tempting to say, yeah, great. Don't do that. Try to say, pretend I'm not here. How confident are you in what you're doing? It's a good response to that type of thing. You want to take useful notes, and we talked about this a little bit already. So navigation tabs, this is an example from a recent study, and which one was this? This was related to our staff directory, where we were testing, can someone find CG, who is Christopher Green, who's our web developer. We wanted to see, can someone find a person by name in our staff directory, and then we wanted to find out, can a person find a department. So we captured navigation paths, the number of attempts it took, the time on task, and then ultimately were they successful or did they fail. And it's kind of interesting, so you can see that that first task only took 1 attempt and 15 seconds, and they were successful. So wow, that's like a 15-second test, and I just learned that this is an easy thing to do on our website. That's great. The second thing took 5 attempts and 3 minutes, which is a long time to find something on a website. 3 minutes doesn't sound like a lot, but when you actually observe someone going through that and taking 5 different attempts to find something, okay, they were successful, but they were successful after 5 attempts. So we need to work on that and make that make it easier for people to find that information. And I talked about capturing quotes, kind of the power of quotes. These are all from, I think, the same study, actually, on the staff directory, where these are some of the quotes that our students captured as they were testing other students. And they were just interesting, and some of them related specifically to the test, and some were just interesting comments. So our generation is dependent on search bars. When you're doing a usability study and you tell someone they can't use the search, which is a common thing to do because we want to test the navigation maybe, that can freak people out because some students in the younger generation especially only use search. They don't use website navigation. So that's going to make it much harder for them. So just thinking about that and can change your perspective a little bit. I don't like a lot of clicks, something that we heard. I haven't accessed the website fully, so that was just a useful thing to find out. Like, okay, they're not familiar with the library website at all, so that's just good information as we're analyzing our results. I thought this was an interesting one. Usually when I want to find something, I go to the search engine. This relates to the earlier one about dependency on search bars and how important search is for the experience. So if your search site doesn't work well, you could be in real trouble if that's the only thing people are using. And then this was another one sort of specific to the test that was very helpful as we analyzed our results. So they said I didn't see the first link because I was looking to titles with Otis, and I didn't notice it was in subtitles. So that really helped us think about the layout of the page and how people were interpreting information on the page. And then at some point, you'll have to end the test. So it could be that the person spent 15 seconds, was successful and completed the task, and then they move on. But it could be that they're not being successful, and you've been sitting with this person now for 10 or 15 minutes, and maybe at this point you're not learning anything new. And it can be hard to sort of judge at what point do you then end the test if the person is not being successful. So this is something that kind of comes over time as you do more of these. But my main sort of tenets around that is when you aren't learning anything new, then it's time to end the test. So it could be that it's a fascinating 20 minutes, and every time they're going somewhere else, you're learning something new, so you want to keep going, assuming that they want to keep going at that point, and you can kind of judge that. But when it is time to end that test, saying something like, thank you so much for your time, this has been really helpful, and just making sure that they don't feel badly or that they failed if they don't complete the task. So letting them know that this is really helpful, this input's going to help design changes, it's going to make things much better for everybody, so thank you so much for your time, this was helpful. That's the best way to end a test when ultimately someone's not successful. And then you're going to have to do it all over again. So I said a little bit earlier that we usually aim for 5. I'd say a minimum of 3, so the least you can do, just bring in 3 people, that's one task, it'll take you half an hour, and see what kind of input you get. So again, Cameron is in all these slides there, and then Donovan on the right is our graduate student, so I think he was taking notes and Cameron was facilitating this test, and again in our library lobby, and that we would just kind of repeat the same thing, the same pattern. Okay, let's test the next person, let's test the next person. We actually got, it wasn't a usability test, but we did an impression test earlier this week, and I was just there for an hour, and it was more like 45 minutes because we had technical problems in getting the laptop going. And in 45 minutes, we had 7 people, I think, come through, so we were able to really do a lot just in a short amount of time. So time for some questions about that. So now thinking about actually conducting the test and facilitating that, I'd be curious to hear about challenges that you've had or that you might anticipate having in that process.
Rebecca, this is Nanette. One of the questions that I had, or picking up on the last point, was about the faculty coming. You know, how to answer that. What's in it for me? Where students will respond to candy. I don't know. Working in some organizations, I've found that I have to get into what's in it for them. What is coming to this usability test help me take off their desk, or make our service to them better in a way that helps them do their job. You had some pretty high response rates on that, so I was wondering what your thoughts were.
Yeah, so there's I'll say a couple different things. One thing for faculty that we found has been helpful is rather than sending out a broad sort of newsletter style thing to a bunch of faculty, is we've done really targeted individual faculty members that we have previous relationships with or that our liaison librarians have relationships with directly. So with a study over the summer for our research support services, we had individual liaisons send us emails of people that they thought were around in the summer and that could participate, and so we emailed them directly. And in the emails that we sent out, the message that we used that I think was the subject line said, help us improve library research support for faculty. And then in the, I don't think I actually have the recruitment email anywhere in here, but I'd be happy to share it. We said, you know, if you spend this time, it's going to help us improve the visibility of these services, which are actually services that they had used. That was part of it too, was they're already a member of the audience that's using the thing. So if we improve the service, it's going to improve their lives because they're users of the service. But we also really emphasize that it's improving it for faculty across campus. So sort of the impact of it and the goodwill of doing that is going to help you as an individual using the service and also help all the other faculty across campus. And so that's kind of a powerful message of this is going to impact other people and make their lives easier and save them time. Time is a huge thing. Funding is a huge thing. And it was actually interesting because in the study itself, we learned so much more about faculty motivations and challenges. Some of their challenges are around collaboration and being siloed in their own departments, and they want to collaborate more, and they want more research funding, and that's hard, and all those types of things, which kind of also helps me think about angles of what are their values and what motivates them. But we were successful, I think, at direct personal contact. One of the things I also said, I remember in some of the emails at least, was like I remember Annabelle Nunez, who's one of our health sciences librarians, had said that these people were really responsive. So I said in the email, Annabelle said that I could get in touch with you, and she said that you've been really responsive and helpful in the past. So kind of giving them that, I don't know, like pat on the back, or, you know, we really appreciate this, and we've had this previous experience with you, and we know you provide really good advice because you're so insightful and thoughtful and helpful, and I think that helps motivate them as well.
So basically you made it personal, and you created a relationship with them, which didn't just help you with usability testing, it helped you with the long-term relationship with the library as well. So it's doing two things at once, which comes back to your point from last week that you had, that one of the unexpected findings was that students remember librarians to go to the classroom.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing with faculty, which is nice. That's a takeaway we can take across the board. So I think Ann has a question.
Well, yeah, actually Virginia had a question about when you're working with one device for your participants in your study. Is it a part of the workflow before the next participant begins that you clear the browser history after each tester?
It's not. And actually that's, it's interesting because like a visited link might look visited. We don't, I mean, there's not a way that they can actually see what the previous person had done, but potentially if you're testing something and there's a list of 10 links and the correct answer that will make them successful in the task is the 5th link and someone previously clicked on it and then the visited link makes it look like that, that will mess up your results. That's actually that's a good suggestion. We haven't done that, but I think that's a good suggestion. The visited link thing especially is coming to my mind because I've observed that. Not a lot, not enough to have thought of that as a really basic way to fix that problem, so thank you. I will start doing that. We haven't talked about that. I don't know if there's other concerns about browser history beyond the visited link thing is what comes to mind.
Okay, cool. Kudos, Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I move on?
Yeah, I think that's it for me on my end, and we're good? I think so.
Okay. So once you've conducted the test, here's Cameron and Donovan again, doing a debrief right afterwards. So while the study is fresh in your mind, really thinking through what are the themes, the things that we heard, or the patterns, what were the biggest surprises of user behavior that we didn't really expect. I'm doing that right afterwards. So it could be that you're doing a 2-hour slot where you're recruiting people and going through all of this testing and then you debrief at the very end of that 2 hours, or it could be a 1-minute debrief between sessions. And I kind of prefer the latter in addition to the former. So especially if it was a really interesting test where there was something new or different, to talk about it right away while it's fresh in your mind has been really helpful. One thing to be careful of, you might have seen this graphic if you've I've seen this graphic in a lot of places, but I still love it. And it's just a don't blame the user thing. So a lot of times people will observe a test and they'll say, that's not how you're supposed to do it. You know, that they were doing the wrong thing. Why does, like, blaming that person for their behavior when it was really the website issues and pain points that caused the user to act that way. And really making sure that you're not then going into the we're testing the user thing. We're not testing the user, we're testing the product, we're testing the website. Then you want to get into the mind of the user and think about, well, what was he or she thinking, and why wasn't he or she successful, and what was really going on there. And a lot of that you'll get from the anecdotal information as they're talking aloud, which is why I really like the talking aloud method, is to get at the why. So you'll know the what, because you'll know exactly where they clicked and where they went, and ultimately if they were successful, but you don't necessarily know why they did that. So that's why really getting to that while the person is in front of you and understanding that is important. And then when you have that information, focusing on what are the most serious of problems. So you might uncover a lot of issues that can be overwhelming at times, so really focusing on the most serious problems. And that could be if 100% of people failed, or even if a significant number of people failed. Definitely that should be kind of brought to the top and the priority of we really need to fix this. If most people were successful but it took them a couple of attempts, maybe it's not as important. It's a bummer, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that should be a priority over something else that's really where people are failing and not getting to reach the task and complete the task. Another thing is focus on those problems that are really the easiest to fix. So what's the little tiny things that you can do? What is the least you can do? That's another Steve Krug thing, where he talks about that, and maybe there's something really minor that you can do now that would have a big impact. And so focusing on those things and trying to do them immediately or as soon as possible is a good way to approach how you prioritize things as well. So here's an example that's dated now. It's one of my first examples. It's from 2012, but I still like it because it shows, I think it just shows pretty clearly how a very, very small thing can make a very big difference. So you can see on the right side under Today in the Libraries, on our website, we had a link that was view all events, and then we had a link called calendar. And we were testing our hours, which primary task, find the hours on the library website. So we were asking people to find hours for days that weren't today. So in order to do that, they would have to go to see the more detailed hours. But we found that people were clicking on the link that said calendar, so they wanted to see a calendar of hours. But the calendar took them to an event calendar. So we then changed the link from calendar to say event calendar, and it fixed 100% of those problems. So that was a very small thing. All it was one word, and it made a huge impact to a primary task on our website. So I just really like that example of something we discovered and fixed immediately. So, I know it did that. Oh, there it is. Okay. This is an old slide I've reused. I forgot there was an animation there. So yeah, so you can see now event calendar is what we changed it to, and it fixed those problems. Ah, there's another animation. There we go. Okay. I should update that slide, but I've used it a few times. Here's a new slide that no one's seen before. So it's hot off the presses. So in this example, this was testing LibCal this summer. And the default in LibCal when you're reserving a room says nicknames as the field. And we found that people weren't using it and didn't quite understand what it was. So we changed it from nickname to public name, and then we added examples to make it more clear what we were really asking for. So as they're reserving a room, they can write down the public name for the reservation, like it's the English TA's meeting, and then it will show up publicly so that if an English TA knows that there's a room booked, they can go see the list and see where that room is for that particular event. So that's, again, small change, just a little piece of content that made that much easier for people and valuable for them now they knew what it was. Well, those are all going to be animated because I copied it from the other slide. It's funny. So that means there's one here. Yes, there it is. So collections. So here's another example, somewhat recent, for a special collections website. And here we heard that for people who had never used special collections before, that weren't familiar with it, really didn't have a mental model of what special collections is, when they would go to the collections page, it was very unclear to them, how do I access this thing? Is this just an online thing? Is it something I can see in person? So we added a little bit of content at the top that said that we have this digital content that you can explore online, but we also have physical content accessible in person. So all of these collections are listed below. We did find people would go to this section of the site and assumed it was just the online digital collections and that there wasn't anything about the content you can access in person. So we added that. We also added links to how to use collection guides and how to use collections to plan their visit if they wanted to see the stuff in person. So that was, again, just content, made things much easier, much more clear. Arrows coming, there it is. Added a form field for country. So this was also, I think, in the last 6 months, we created a student employment application where we found out through usability testing with actual students that it wasn't inclusive because if you were an international student who had worked outside of the country, you could not reflect that in the application. So initially we just had city and state listed for previous work history. We added a field for country so that it was inclusive of international students or anyone else that had worked overseas. And so that was, again, small little change that we made that really made a big difference to any international student that, or person that's worked outside this country that is visiting and trying to apply for a job here in the library. So there might be other things that you learned in your user research that maybe don't relate specifically to your goal. This is something I mentioned last time, but I just wanted to mention again, especially for people that weren't here last time, that you might uncover things that aren't related to your goal that are really important or useful for other units in the library or for other work that you're doing. So this is the one that Nanette remembered, that third bullet, students remember librarians who came to their class. And we discovered this because someone saw Leslie Saltz, who's one of our liaison librarians. They saw her face in the staff directory and said, hey, that's Leslie, I remember her from my class. And then it was really weird because Leslie was actually walking through the library at the time. It was a very strange moment, but it was very cool that person did remember her, and it was a year or two before she had actually come to the class, but it was that meaningful to that student. And then other things like the faculty wanted to find people by expertise. We keep hearing that loud and clear, and it's going to change how we approach contact information on our website. Instructors usually direct students to Google Scholar rather than the library. Really important thing for our instruction and liaison librarians to know that, so that they can work with those instructors and see what they can do to maybe change that approach to searching. I think I had this in the other one too, some other sort of examples of the squashed assumptions. So we often hear that people won't scroll, and we did testing and found out that people do scroll and they will scroll. With LibCal, we found something related to where to click on the screen to reserve your room. We made an assumption that people would really understand that. They would see it visually and completely understand it, and that wasn't the case. And with the student job application, which is the example I showed a little bit ago, students don't know there's a student ID numbers, and we assumed that they did. So another little tiny thing we did related to that was we added a link to find out what your student ID is and sent them to a place where they could log in with their net ID, which they are comfortable with, and find out what their student ID is in order to fill out the form. And this is something I said last time, so just to remember that you can usually come up with something that's going to make an impact once you come up with your results. And it might not be the perfect thing, but there's usually something, whether it's a link label or a heading, navigation element, a little piece of content, a little bit of help text. You can usually do something that will improve things at least a little bit. And if it's better than the current state, go for it. So again, I mentioned this last time, but thinking of this now in context of everything else is you're going to find a lot of information. It's going to be very hard to fix everything that you discover. Don't fall into the trap of, well, next year we're getting a new system, so let's not bother to change anything now, especially in a university setting where we have, 4,000 new students this year that are going to see the impacts of that. It's just massive amounts of people that we're going to impact if we change something now that's maybe small and not perfect. We don't really want to wait a whole nother year for something bigger and better when there's something we could do now to improve the current state. So even if it's a Band-Aid, if there's something little you can do, it's probably worth doing now if you can. So question time again, and I'd be curious to hear from people that have done usability testing what changes they've made. If you've done have any similar examples to sort of the ones that I described.
Rebecca, while we're waiting for answers, this is Nanette. I'll do one coming back to the staff piece. As the designer working behind RDA, one of the usability tests that we did with staff using guides was that we needed an unexpected result was we needed to tone down the design. They wanted less on the screen, not more. They didn't want it to look like external patrons. They wanted it to look like Excel. And it really increased their efficiency as well because we went on to measure efficiency. Have you had any experiences like that that are pretty counterintuitive to those of us that play around on the web a lot?
Right, when you think, well, actually it sort of relates to this impression testing stuff we did this week, maybe just because it's in my mind. It was with students, and I assumed that students want like the simplest results when they're looking in the catalog. They want like the title, the subject, the call number. They don't want to see all the other fluff. But then when we did this impression testing, we learned some pretty interesting things, that there were some people that saw the detailed information. Even when it didn't have information they necessarily used, they liked all the detail because they felt like they knew more, even though they didn't really know what it was. It was kind of an interesting dynamic of they loved, there were some people that said they wanted the simple one, but most people, majority, wanted the detailed one, even if they didn't really know why, just because it made them feel better. Like it made them feel like we were being transparent and sharing all the information with them that we had, and we weren't hiding things from them. So that was kind of an interesting, not intuitive thing that we learned, at least from students. I'm trying to think if there's anything we learned from internal staff.
While you're thinking about that, Pam notes that they changed wording, and that the area that they made the most changes was to their responsive mobile site. And she notes they made a lot of changes as a result of testing to the mobile site.
Cool. That's great. Yeah, and it's kind of a constant thing. And, oh.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask Ann if she had any chats.
No, I think we're still thinking about all the good information Rebecca shared with us during that segment. We don't have anything else, and we're still absorbing on this end. But we're still open.
I will back out and let you continue, Rebecca. Sure. Sounds good. I just thought of something else, and I can't remember what it was. Maybe it'll come to me. I'll keep going. So we're going to move on a little bit from usability testing, and we're going to talk about other research methods. So there's lots of things you can do beyond usability testing to gather that user input in different ways for different purposes. I'm going to focus, just because we only have this amount of time, I can't go into all of these, so I'm going to focus on card sorting, so I'll get into that. I'll give really brief descriptions of what these other things are if you're not familiar with them. So impression testing I mentioned a couple times because we've done this pretty recently and over the past couple of years, where you're not testing someone on a task, but you're getting their immediate impressions on something that you're showing them visually. So the test on the metadata descriptions of catalog records was something where we just printed out pieces of paper of government documents records and then asked people what they thought. And tell me what you're seeing, tell me what you think these describe, tell me what you think is helpful, that kind of thing. Another thing we did impression testing for was on our social media and our news and events, where we printed out, again, pieces of paper that had examples of different events and news stories pulled from our social media channels and from our main website, and asked people what they thought and what's most interesting to you and why, and would you ever go to something like this? And this was really helpful. It was a partnership with our marketing department to hear from students directly what type of content they want to see on our social media. First click testing is where you do ask them to interact with the thing, but you just give them the first click. So let's say you show them a home page and say, where would you go to X, and then see where they click. This can be done on an actual computer, but it can also be done just on a piece of paper. Here's what a screen looks like, where would you go? And they can point to things and tell you where they would click first. And there's also software for this if you're trying to get, especially if you're trying to get mass responses from people, you can actually do this online. Collaborative prototyping is something where you bring in at least a couple of people. Usually we bring in like 2 or 3 people, not a ton of people. Depends on what you're doing, but for actually sort of sketching out and prototyping something. So we did this with some faculty on a homepage redesign effort where we said, together we want you to sketch out your ideal library homepage and talk about it as a collaboration between people. And that's been really interesting to get that kind of feedback. A/B testing is a version of multivariate testing where you're giving people 2 different options and seeing which one is more successful. This usually means you're actually doing it using a tool online where just out in the real world, if someone gets to your website, they could see version A or they could see version B. And then you track the Google Analytics data and see which button is more successful. So if we call it search or we call it find, what's more successful, who clicks on which thing more. This is used a lot, I know, with Amazon. So sometimes Amazon has 2 separate sites going at the same time, and you don't know which one you're going to get, and there's a slight difference because they're trying to test something. So that's another interesting tool that you can think about. Information architecture, or IA validation. There's a tool called TreeJack that we've used. It's a part of the Optimal Workshop suite, and I highly recommend it. It's a great way to test out navigation elements and see where people are going to go in your navigation to find a specific thing. So you give them a task, and then they don't see a website, they just see a list of links, and they have to click on them to find the things they need. This was really helpful in designing the architecture of our site. Then there's user interviews, talking one-on-one with people, asking them open-ended questions, learning about their experience. Focus groups is like user interviews but in a group. And then surveys, I think everyone knows about surveys. So lots of different ways that you can gather input depending on what you're trying to do. But I'm going to talk about card sorting because this is an interesting one and something that can be used in a variety of contexts for different things and something that I have a lot of experience with. So I wanted to share some thoughts on that. So a card sorting is an activity where people are organizing topics into categories that make sense to them. And so this is going to help us think about how to organize content on our website in a way that people understand it and that makes sense to them, given their mental models. So in this example, and the white cards are the topics or the pieces of content that live under those categories. So there's 2 variations on this. There's open card sorting, which is one where you have all of your cards written out, just the white cards. And so the participant just sees the white cards, they group them, and then they write the category that makes sense to them for that grouping. So participants are the ones labeling the category. So it's an open card sort. We don't predetermine anything. We just say, here's a bunch of stuff, organize it into groups that make sense to you. Then there's closed card sorting, which is where you do predetermine the categories for them. So you give them potentially your set of menu labels that you're thinking of for your website, and then you give them all the content you think is going to live under those labels, and then you ask them to move those under the cards. So there's you can do it with index cards and traditional cards like the other slide, or you can use something that's an online tool like Optimal Sort, which is also part of that Optimal Workshop suite that we have, and this is where they drag and drop. And what's nice about this is it captures all that data for you, so you don't have to then manually go in and type it into a spreadsheet. Although I do kind of like the traditional in-person sorting on a table too. I like the analog way that it happens, but the online tool is helpful too, and we've done both. So this is actually from the Researcher Services project from this past summer that I've mentioned before. We did open card sorting to start, and then we did closed card sorting once we had some ideas of the categories based on the open sort. So that's a method that you can think about using. You can also do hybrid card sorting. So this is also something that we've tried with, and different variations on it as well. You can get pretty creative with this. So in the hybrid card sorting, participants are going to get predetermined categories, but they can then also write their own categories. So you don't limit them to just the ones you give them. If they feel like there should be another category for some of the content, they can create their own. So in this example, preserving and archiving was the category that we gave them. And then they said, well, actually, I would split up preserving and archiving into data and preservation. Should I read the screen? Yeah, that makes sense. So data and preservation, and then they grouped them under those 2 subcategories that they thought made more sense to them. I really like doing pair or team sorting, so having a couple of people participate in the activity as opposed to just one. This is an example from the summer. And what's funny, so this is Paul and Christina. Turns out that they're married, and we didn't realize it, so it was our first ever couples card sort. We recruited them. They work a lot with the library. They're faculty. They teach in chemistry and the sciences, but we didn't actually realize that when we were recruiting, we recruited a married couple. So this was kind of a cool one where they did it as a team, and because they had that prior relationship, they were able to be really open and honest and critique each other and talk through their decision-making, and it was just a very interesting experience to kind of watch that and how that went. So, and I realized I made a mistake on the slide, and that's just the description from what a hybrid sort is. And this version was a hybrid sort. But I recommend if there's a way to do the team sorting that you do. You can do the index cards on the table, and you can do the online one, and both can be moderated. So you can moderate an online sort, and that's actually what we did. I think that might be the next slide, yeah. So remote sorting, we used Adobe Connect. And so what was nice about this is he could share his screen. We gave him the link to open up the study and then talk us through it, because a lot of the information you get from these, learning the why, and again, that kind of talking out loud and sharing your experience is really helpful. And if you don't have that and you just have the raw quantitative data, you might see that people are putting stuff in the categories that you expect, but you don't really know why, or they're putting them in categories that you don't expect and you don't know why. So just having that in-person conversation with them as they talk through the reasoning for what they're doing and why they're naming things the way they're naming, that can be really helpful. So this was nice because we could share the screen and have the person on a webcam and have a conversation with them as they were going through the activity. And so when you've done card sorting, then you get a bunch of results. And then what do you do with that? This is a screenshot from Optimal Sort, which is nice because, like I said, they pull all that data for you, and they have a few different visualizations of the data, which is helpful. Here you can see this is percentages, so you can see the percentage of people that put certain things in certain categories. So the ones that are really high, like exhibitions, went under exhibitions and events. Almost everybody, 105 people. Actually, no, this is people, it's not percentages, I'm realizing. So this was one that, actually, this was a few years ago. It was the Center for Creative Photography website redesign, and we sent this out to a lot of people. So it wasn't moderated, so we don't have the why, but we did get a lot of people to respond. So we had, looks like 107 people, which is something that we couldn't reasonably do in a in-person setting. We couldn't moderate 107 sessions. It would just be too much. So this worked all for that particular project. And you can see for some things it was very high correlation of, okay, everyone's going to know to go to exhibitions for this. Everyone's going to know to go to expect the calendar under events and that kind of thing. So one of the things to focus on, so there's the quantitative side of things of like, okay, we have good correlation here. It's the things that are less clear that are really what you should focus on. So things where there was vast differences. So should for education be under study and research or rights and reproduction? So it looks like it was split really closely. So that's where you want to have those conversations and think about why people did that. Focusing on the themes when you're doing the in-person sessions is really important. What are the big things that seem to be common among people? Pay attention to terminology that they're using. So whether they're writing the name of a category or they're speaking aloud and describing something, what are the terms they're using and the language they're using? And then remembering that card sorting is not intended to be determinative. So you're not supposed to get a bunch of numbers and say, okay, based on this data, I'm going to put this thing here, because it's an artificial environment and it's not really how people interact with the web. So it's not, it can be a piece of data that guides you in your decision making, but you shouldn't see it as this is going to help me decide exactly what my information architecture for my site is going to be, because that's just not realistic. But it is really helpful in guiding those conversations and helping you get to a more useful architecture for your site. So questions about card sorting. I'd be curious if other people have used this and what sort of things you've used it for. And since I'm not going into the other methods, I'd also be curious about other methods that you're using.
Rebecca, this is Nanette. While we're waiting for questions on the card sorting specifically, you may have mentioned this and I may have missed it, so I apologize if it's a repeat, but you did a big test and noted in the big test that both you didn't have time to get the details and you were looking at vast differences or places where things were very close together and there wasn't much difference. Do you ever use those results to tailor the one-on-one, the 5 sessions, or the intercept testing?
I think I lost you on that.
Oh,
can you remind me what I said? The big differences and the small differences?
You were talking about that on a large test like that last slide, that you were looking for the big differences and the places where there wasn't much testing.
Okay.
Do you then take that result into smaller setting testing, like 5?
Okay, I know what you're saying. Yes, good question. So one thing that's interesting, and this was a while ago now, we did, a lot of times card sorting is done for an entire website. Like that's a really common thing to do, is to start with your whole website and see like kind of top level navigation, what types of things should be on your top level menus. But we've used card sorting a lot more now to get at that, those smaller things where things really didn't correlate in the larger thing. So for example, we did a card sort specifically on our tutorials and our guides, which at one point were all under the same section. And we wanted to see, how do people think about these things? Like, should they really belong together? Is a research guide the same thing as a how-to tutorial on using Academic Search Complete? Do people think of those in the same way? We've done very specific tests for specific sections of the site. So like the one, the Center for Creative Photography one, the last site that was that massive one, was for the whole site. But then there's like, okay, so we have the sense of the whole site, but then we don't have the sense of the pieces of the site and how to structure something within the site. So we've used it a lot more now just for sections to make those smaller decisions, because that's a lot of times where the harder decisions come, are in those individual sections. I'm not sure if that's what your question was, but.
Yeah, I think it addressed it. We have Michelle noting that they used card sorting to redesign some of their departmental websites, like Research Commons, and she also noted that we use it to reorganize the navigation.
Yeah. Cool.
And along that same line, Greg points out that his library, they use card sorting to test their drop-down menus. So what you were saying about individual pieces rather than the whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Some good examples have come through.
Great. And I mean, it can get hard too, because websites don't just have like 2 tiers of structure. Like there's not just things, like things live under things that live under things that live under things. And so card sorting is really limited in that like things don't naturally all fall under one thing. And another, you know, it's a lot of times we do need to cross-list content in different sections and links to different sections. It's a web, like it's a web of content, so it's not as cut and dry as what card sorting kind of artificially makes it, but it is a really helpful starting point, and I've used it for stuff actually way beyond the website, like for collaborative activities with library staff about like how to prioritize work and like how to think about how do we structure job descriptions. Like there's so many different ways that you can use this tool. I find it really useful.
Well, it looks like on this end we don't have any more comments in chat, so I will sign off and let you get to the rest of the presentation.
Great. So into part 2. The first part was the biggest part, so I'm looking at the time. We have half an hour left, and the rest of the presentation is really about how do you set a foundation in your library for this type of work to kind of keep it in the front of people's minds and keep it sustainable over time. So I want to talk a little bit about making the case in your library. So thinking about how do you make the case for an empathetic mindset among your library staff, making the case for user research and that the return on investment is worthwhile, and then how do you make the case for content strategy? And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. So thinking about making the case for empathy and sort of fostering empathy among your staff, storytelling is a really powerful way to do this. So I know I mentioned earlier about quotes, and someone had a question about stakeholders that disagree with the findings, and then I talked about the power of, you know, if you show a video of someone that did a usability test, that's a really good way to kind of get that person thinking about the user in a different light. Storytelling is powerful, and Whitney Quesenberry wrote a book on storytelling for the user experience, and I just really like this quote. She says the power of stories allows us to see the world through a new lens, and that one of the hardest things to do is to understand a task, context, or experience as someone else does. Once you see a design problem from the new perspective, through the perspective or lens of a story, you're halfway home to a solution. So she has I actually just heard a podcast from her in the last couple of weeks, and then I added this quote because I thought it was just thinking of the power of that storytelling as a way to inform staff and kind of guide decision-making and get us really thinking from a different perspective. Data alone, quantitative data, can't always do that. So personas, and so this gets back to, I said earlier that I have a slide coming up about this. And this is our personas. I shared them in the last presentation. And you can see the top row is our primary personas, and the bottom row is our secondary personas. And these are fictional characters that represent our targeted audience segments. So people that most use library products and services, or are potential users of library products and services. And by having these personas in mind, it really helps us as we're having conversations and we're making decisions to talk about our audience. They started off as being used primarily for the website because they were built around the website steering group and our web redesign project. But they are now used across the library. So our communications council, when we're doing a big renovation project in the library called the Student Success District, and one of our very early partners in that project learned about our personas and thought, wow, this is great, we should use these as we're thinking about redesigning our spaces and who we're designing our spaces for. So they've got kind of mass appeal in that way. It's not just about the website. As you're building personas and thinking about how you go about doing this and where do you start, looking at real data, potentially data that you already have. So a lot of libraries do gather this type of data from their users on a regular basis. It could be through interviews and focus groups, question logs, which I mentioned, I think, earlier, analytics data for your website, so what are the most popular pages, and helping define and describe your audience based around that. And surveys are another way. And I'd be curious if other people have done persona projects, what data they've pulled into that to kind of describe who those people are. And this is an example just from a while back on when we did a website survey and we asked, we did audience segments, so people would identify as an undergrad or grad or faculty, and then we would ask them, what do you use the library for? And we used a lot of that data to then inform our persona design. So this was, let me make sure I'm being honest, I think this was this was graduate students. So this was our graduate student results. They weren't huge numbers, but we did use both this and our focus groups and our analytics data. We pulled data from a lot of different places, which is really probably the best method as opposed to just sticking with one type of data, is to look at the bigger picture and kind of make that whole story based on all the pieces of data. And you also want to make them real. So in order for people to actually buy into this, one of the things that we did is we had a Meet Your Personas open house for library staff. And I thought this was a really fun project. So we had their stuff. So Brandon is on the left-hand side. He's our PhD graduate student. And this is his stuff. This is his backpack and what's in his backpack. So it's a real backpack. He rides a bike into the campus. He has a little girl, so that's her clothes and her baby book. He's also working on his dissertation, so he has a book about writing his dissertation. And he likes the outdoors and hiking, so we have a hiking book there. And you can't actually see all the other things, but it gives you a sense of, like, this is a real person, and this is their day-to-day life, and, like, let's really be thinking about this person. We had a variety of activities where people could take a little quiz and find out which persona they were most like. We had a bunch of tasks for the primary things that these people are interested in related to the library. And then we also had a thing about how do we incorporate personas into our project and into our work. It was like a drag and drop kind of thing that we had on a whiteboard. And on the right side, this is Cheyenne on the right, who, not a real person, but she's holding Cheyenne. That's Ray, our web designer, holding the photo of Cheyenne for the picture. And you can see in the background, there's a yoga mat. What was that? Oh, that was Elle, our staff member. So we have a yoga club, and Elle, who is our persona for library staff, so it's the yoga club, so that's our yoga mat. So this is just one example of a way that you might think about making those personas come to life and building that empathy in your organization for the end user. So this, I had the slide from last time. It's just the principle of doing user research and really trying to make decisions based on user research and not the loudest voice in a room of stakeholders. This is an example of the collaborative prototyping I mentioned earlier. This was a couple of faculty members working with us on thinking about a homepage redesign and what they'd want to see and talking through it. And we actually had a full-size screen on the left, and then we had a mobile version on the right. People did really struggle with the mobile version to figure out what's most important and what should be at the top of the homepage. As far as making the case for user research and just user experience in general, this is a great graphic that lists out some data of why this is important for return on investment. One thing that's funny I noticed in our test run, as I looked at the slide more closely, I realized that they're missing some numbers. So it says 1, 2, 5, 4, 6. I don't understand what happened there, but the contents I thought was still useful, so I left it on here. That by building user research into your project, you're going to increase conversions, whatever those might be for you, whether it's checking out a book or donating money or whatever the things are that people do to use your services. It reduces the amount of waste, so we can prioritize things better because we know what matters and what's going to have the most impact to users. It reduces the risk of really building the wrong thing or building for something that's not something people are going to use. Lowering support calls, so it's going to really decrease staff time in responding to people that have questions where the question is easily understandable and the responses on the website, it's easy to find. We did something in our library loan where we updated the forms, and we were able to decrease the number of mistakes that people made on the forms and therefore decrease staff time in mediating those mistakes. So those types of things can really help make that case for user experience. And now, I mean, and this was actually, yes, from 2014, so it's a little bit dated, but even at that time, 93% of executives were already saying that improving the user experience was a top strategic priority. So I think maybe that's up to 100 now. People are really getting it. They're getting it outside of libraries, and they're starting to really get it inside libraries as well. And talking about the least you can do, so time is always an issue, and justifying spending a lot of time doing this work can be hard, especially if you have a job where this isn't really part of your regular job. So guerrilla testing, keeping it very simple. Intercept recruitment we talked about. Bring your own device. You don't need to get fancy equipment to do this. You can just focus on one primary task that's most important to people and start there. So start small, start with 3 people, bag of candy, and see what you can find. And then I want to talk a little bit about content strategy and making the case for this. So content first is something I mentioned in the last session. This is a quote by Christina Halverson, who I had another quote from in the last session, but this quote defines what content strategy really is. And so it's planning for the creation, delivery, and governance of useful, usable content. And content and user experience design go hand in hand, because even if you have a beautiful, usable design, you have great navigation, once you get down into the weeds of the content on your site, if people get there and they don't understand the content, they still can't be successful in completing the task or getting to the information that they need. So content strategy helps make that possible and make that much easier. And so content strategy, when done well, is going to sustain content over time, so you don't have content rot or content that is no longer useful or usable. You can reduce technical debt. So you might have many things that have built up in your library over the last 20 or so years, and this can help get rid of some of that stuff because you're, over time, building workflows in for sustainability and who's going to be in charge of updating this, what are the workflows, that kind of thing. It can help you prioritize work and, again, focus on what's most impactful to users. It can help you anticipate the future needs of your users and your organization. And it's going to also make things consistent so that you have a seamless experience as people are going through your content and navigating to different parts of your website or other tools that you offer. And it's a way to engage new users. So when you have a good voice and tone and you're able to message things well and focus on that key messaging and work with marketing to get stuff out there in social media and other channels, that's a really good way to engage new people to come and use your library. And it's going to improve the library's reputation. So if you have content that's consistent, that's easy to understand, that people like and appreciate, you're going to just get a better reputation out there, and people will know that they can come to your site and get what they need. And it can also demonstrate the value of your library. So the least you can do for content strategy, and I teach a whole 4-week class on content strategy, and there's books on it and websites. It's a huge field. But just thinking about this presentation, I feel like everyone should have a style guide for their library, and not everyone does. And this could be something that you could start out small and just come up with a list of terminology that you use on your site that is currently inconsistent that you want to make consistent. So this is a word list from our style guide, which I realized I didn't put the link in here, but we do have our style guide online. It's available in Gitbooks, and I can send that link out somehow, or I'll put it in the chat at the end of this, so that if you wanted to take a deeper look at what kind of stuff we put in our style guide, this is just one example, is the basic word list of how do we hyphenate email or not. Is full text hyphenated? Is it capitalized? Is homepage one word or two? Those types of things. So the very least I think that you can do is kind of making a style guide to be more consistent. And so now I'm curious if people want to share anything about how you've made a case at your library, and maybe what is there something that you think you could do tomorrow to implement more user experience work in your library? I'm curious what you think.
Rebecca, this is Nanette. I'm going to let you keep going, and we'll capture all questions. Please type them in, folks. All questions that come in, we'll catch at the end so that we make sure that we get through all of our slides with the 18 minutes we have left.
Sounds good. I can't remember what's left. Oh, yes, there's more. So make it stick. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how you sort of build on the strengths of your library and your staff, and then also sustain this type of work over time. It's a gross picture, I apologize, but I thought it was kind of interesting. Make it stick, I don't know. So one thing that you can think about doing is putting user experience as a term and a concept within your job descriptions. And this could be job descriptions on, if you're hiring a web designer, that would be kind of an obvious one. But also when you're hiring new librarians, to put that in there as something that is a value and is a concept, and maybe seeing if there's ways to include it in interviews to just see, can you hire people that really are student-focused and faculty-focused and want to improve that experience? Most of us kind of are by nature as librarians, but putting that in there and being explicit about it as a value, I think, can be pretty important. Putting someone in charge is helpful. So I've been in charge for a while, at least as far as the website goes. And that was a huge shift for the library where we were very democratic previously as far as who could put things on the website. Everyone could put something on the website, and people could add navigation items, and it became just kind of the Wild West after a while. And it was nice for to have that ability for people to share what they wanted to share with our audience online, but it also just added a huge level of complexity, and it became very hard for users ultimately to navigate our site and find what they needed. There was a lot of duplication. There was a lot of stuff that was outdated. So putting someone in charge to kind of wrangle that and oversee it and make workflows around things and hold people accountable to updating their stuff. And then also being able to kind of coordinate that usability testing effort or other user research efforts can be really helpful to actually make it happen, is to have someone really responsible and accountable to that work. Potentially, you can form a team, whether it's a formal team or an informal team. And we've sort of gone different ways around this at my organization. So we did have what we call the user experience department, but it was really our technology department with a handful of people that did have user experience in their job descriptions. And then last year, we formed a team that was web design and user experience that included a couple of web designers, our content strategist, and myself, and some students. But we've also talked recently about having, to make this more of a library-wide effort, to have a user experience council that brings in stakeholders from across the library that are interested and invested in this type of work to meet regularly, share our stories, collaborate together, and kind of distribute that work a little bit more broadly to be more impactful across the organization. And then another thing we've been talking about recently that I'm really excited about is the idea of really connecting user experience work to assessment work that's going on in our library, and also strategic planning. So that much higher level prioritization of work and trying to have a foundation that's bubbling up that's really the user experience that kind of guides that. And then partnering with assessment, which is also doing a lot of user research with different methods of user research, and building that all together so that it's all kind of intermingled and making it this one beautiful thing that's user experience-driven library, essentially. And so that's a powerful concept, and I'm looking forward to the next couple months. We'll keep talking more about it at my library and how to really do that and do a more iterative strategic planning model as well. And so making it ongoing, this doesn't go away. Usability is something that just becomes like a bigger and bigger beast as our websites get bigger and we have more online tools and more services that are new to libraries that we keep kind of innovating and changing what we do. It's a constant effort, and so keeping users in mind throughout all of that, so things like service design and wayfinding studies and all these different things that are part of that user journey. So, and this is a slide from last time, just similar to what I just mentioned, is that usability is really just the beginning. This is the honeycomb UX by Peter Morville in 2004. So this has been around for a long time. It's not just about usability anymore. There's the value proposition. Is the experience desirable, accessible, credible, findable? There's that much larger picture of the things that we're creating and how to make them of value to people. As user experience is, and this is again a slide from last time, but just to kind of remind you as we're getting close to the end of the slides here, is that user experience really is about the emotions of real people. That's where you get that empathy and that understanding of these are real people living their real lives, and how do we influence that, the value of our products and services, and then how our products and services provide meaning and then really impact the lives of those people who are using it. And we're going to do the final questions and discussions. So any thoughts on anything so far, or ideas about how you might build a culture of user experience at your library?
Wow, Rebecca, you were fast.
Yeah,
this is no. Yes, folks, she was so fast I didn't get my note out about chatting, so please chat your comments and questions. And I want to pick up on one of your points about assessment and strategic planning. We have had the privilege of practicing with Rebecca and knowing where she was taking this, and it played into our scheduling. So if you're there and listening, and it looks like most of you still are, please join us next time for our next hot topic. The hot topic in September is actually engagement, and it builds on the usability points that Rebecca ends her deck here with today. And with that, Anne, I will pass it to you to see if you have any questions or comments coming in.
I don't have any questions and comments coming in, but I have thoroughly enjoyed both these hot topic sessions with Rebecca, and I hope that those of you who have joined us will join us again, because we have continued to learn a lot. And we are getting the thank yous and kudos coming in, Rebecca, so thank you again for this.
Yeah, happy to do it. And I just realized that I could find that style guide. I could maybe post the link. Let me stop sharing. Can I stop sharing my screen? No, we have more slides.
Yeah, we have 2 more slides, but if you want to send that piece to me, I will put it in the email that go out to everybody after the session later today.
Okay,
so,
that sounds good.
So let's see, if you want to go to the next slide.
Sure.
So this is just my plug, as I already started, to join us. These are our next 4 topics. Engagement Basics is next, and it picks up where, as I said, Rebecca left off. We have Digital Literacy Basics, was about creating digital literacy basics programs in your library. And actually, we have an SJSU faculty member who teaches digital literacy to our new MLIS students at SJSU joining us, Baron DeBecker. So I hope you'll join us in October for that. Project Management Basics in November, which is being taught by Rebecca Hastings from the public library side. Not Rebecca, Robin Hastings. There's too many R's in my life. From the public library side, about how to take some of these techniques that you've been learning and putting them into a project plan so that you can deliver and execute. And finally, the last one is, we just announced yesterday, is on metadata management basics. And if you check out the blog that posts here in another hour and a half, you'll see how we're moving into metadata to help you all further and to address questions and problems that are a little deeper than the things we can get to quickly, as Rebecca mentioned earlier about the catalog. Next slide. So basically what we'd like you to do is tell us what you think. There's a survey in the email that you'll get from me. We want to know how this worked, how it didn't, what other topics that you would like to hear about in these hot topic sessions. And you will be getting the email directly from me today, so you can reply back to me with any of these things. If you have closing questions for Rebecca, thoughts, and you want more feedback, I don't have a community section to discuss this yet. That's coming in future sessions. But what we can do, as Rebecca noted as well, is if you send the questions to us, Anne and I have a debrief session on this with Rebecca next week. We'll get the answers, and we'll email them back out to you. And finally, because this is innovative and we do sell these services deeper. Rebecca works with us on that as well. Invite us into your library. If you're ready to go deeper, if you have a specific project that you'd like us to help with, please email any of the three of us and let us know. We'd love to help you. Those are the end of our prepared remarks. Before we sign off, Rebecca or Ann, do you have any closing remarks?
This is Ann, and I do not.
No, just thank you, everyone, for being here, and feel free to reach out if you have other questions or want to collaborate on anything. Yeah, thank you.
Well, so then I will close the session, and what I will say to everyone is thank you so much for joining us, and Rebecca, thank you for letting us come into your library and see how UA has put these things to work. And join us again soon.
Happy to do it. Thanks.